Hi, I'm Mark Clegg and welcome to the Photography Academy, and we're answering a question today about speedlight photography, which is, does shutter speed really matter? Well, the biggest answer, I suppose, in the simplest way is no and yes. Didn't help you, did it? No, apologise. It does matter. Why? Because in flash photography, if we're controlling the ambient light within the scene, shutter speed does matter. Obviously, the triangle of exposure, remember, is shutter speed, aperture, ISO. Those three together are giving us that perfect exposure. However, when we introduce supplementary light, like strobe, flash, speedlight in this case, when we start to introduce that as the main light source within the image, shutter speed will not have a real effect in the basic way, because the speedlight itself is designed to actually overpower any of the ambient light, I presume, and to kind of give you that working exposure that is based on what you want. It does matter though when you're working with very fast shutter speeds, because that is when the flash is going to throw up a problem. And in the same way, when you're working with slower shutter speeds, the flash can create a problem as well. So let's start from the basics. When we're talking about speedlight or strobe, okay, we're on about one of these little things that is either designed to go on the camera hot shoe or to be controlled by the camera, or a controller that is on top of the camera. In this case, I've just kept it nice and simple today. I've kept a speedlight on camera itself. If I was going to go into a normal environment, whether I'm in a studio like we are here, into a bar or into a local park where I'm in the woods and so on, pretty much if I was working in an automatic exposure, I would usually choose aperture priority, because I usually want to actually set that. Okay, so I want to say I want to shoot on f2.8 today. Then if I want the camera to do the automated part, then obviously it's going to, in other words, once I go into aperture priority, all I've got control of is technically the aperture. When I start to introduce flash into the scenario though, and flash works different ways with different kind of cameras, but as a rule of thumb, when you introduce flash, the camera really can't see that when you're in kind of an aperture priority. Why? It kind of still is trying to bring the ambient light together with the working exposure onto the camera itself. So you tend to actually kind of almost be fighting against the automation. So if you do want to use an automation in shutter speed, you want to be in shutter priority, okay? Then at least then you have some control as where we're going through. For myself, whether I'm using flash in TTL mode or wherever it is, the camera is always in a manual working mode for me. So I set ISO, I set shutter speed, I set aperture, and then it's up for me to actually try and get this little flash to actually do its job and kind of create it. Now, like I just said, if I walked into a scene, in other words, you know, I pick up my camera, I take my speedlight out of my bag, I stick it on, I basically switch camera on, I switch the flash on, I'm in manual mode, and basically if I'm going to shoot up to 200th of a second, pretty much I'm working straight away. All right, I can go point, shoot, take the photograph, I'm done. Why? Because basically I'm telling the flash to work in ETTL mode. That's the camera flash default, as it were. So I'm not really taking control of things. However, if I start to move the shutter speed up, even though I'm in manual mode, as soon as I touch the shutter, the camera goes, oh, hang on a minute, you're using flash now. It means that you can't shoot above a certain shutter speed, otherwise you're going to have shutter sync problem. And shutter sync is that thing that basically gives you that black line at the bottom of your photographs. Let me just show you on camera kind of how it kind of works out, all right? So when we're into the flash mode, all right, the first thing that when we kind of, let's just clear it in case I've done any funky settings on it. Nothing else is on. There we go, switch that off. Okay, we're by default, we're into the ETTL mode. That's the evaluative mode, okay? But now if we kind of look at the shutter speed, so just tilt this back here until I can see it. Pretty much it, okay? So In a normal mode, if I just change my shutter speed down and I'm working in the kind of the camera manufacturer's default, basically I can take the photograph and so on, and it's going to do its job. However, if I'm working in normal flash mode, okay, which we did, we just switched it on, and I turn the shutter speed up, it looks like I've just now increased my shutter speed to 800th of a second. However, this is where the communication between the camera and the Speedlite work against you and work for you. What this means now, as soon as I touch it, can you see it? It reduces its shutter speed down straight away. Wrong button, Mark. It reduces its shutter speed down to the 200th of a second, which is the camera manufacturer's default. So in other words, if my working exposure in a manual way was based on that, I'd have an overexposed image of sorts. Now, the only way for me to be able to kind of override the camera at this point is to either switch the flash off. Let me just switch that off. Now you'll see I can control the shutter speed as normal and take a photograph without any trouble, all right? However, the flash didn't fire. As soon as I switch that flash back on again, give it its time to come alive, get its power up in the capacitor, and I take the photograph. As soon as I touch that button, you just saw it drop to 200th of a second. And now it's obviously kind of giving us that warning signal of the F4, whatever it would be. Now, if I want to shoot a 1000th of a second or 800th of a second, I can, but I just need to go back into the flash setup here. So all I've got to do is go into the sync mode, and in this case, it's just got a little button. And as soon as I press that on here, you can see it's come up with that little lightning bolt with a H by the side. So now I've put that on place and we kind of do it again, it means that it now allows me to take the photograph. Okay, it doesn't shut that down. So that's where high-speed sync would really work for us. Why would you use high-speed sync? Like, as I said in other films, that it's about perhaps darkening down skies or throwing a piece of light within a kind of a field where we just want to light the couple. We want to make it look like it's a dramatic style of photograph. So it's all about control and creativity whenever you use flash. My best advice to anybody who's beginning to use Speedlight would be, when you think you don't need to use flash, use it. And when you don't think you need to use flash, obviously use it, then you'll get a different kind of look and feel, all right? So we've just shown shutter speed does affect, in fact, the working scenario in here. And basically when the ambient light is equal to the flash, obviously the flash is going to have less an effect. Mention as well about if I want to work in very, very slow shutter speeds, I can work back in manual mode. So in other words, we come back onto here and we press that sync button once more. We come back into this manual kind of normal flash mode, all right? Now, in this case, just tilt the camera down again so we can see the shutter speed. Okay, if I press the button, all right, it says, whoa, you can't do that. Okay, we've covered that one, but I can take the photograph, but it's dropped the shutter speed down. Notice though, it automatically goes back to 1000th a second. And if I want to shoot at that, I've either got to switch off the flash or go to the high speed sync mode. However, when I dial the shutter exposure down, as low as I want, I can work at any shutter speed I want. Okay, it'll just do it. Okay, I've got no trouble there at all. And basically by doing that, it's going to do a photograph. However, when you can see here things like half a second and a third of a second, fifth of a second, and so on and so on, okay, it's going to really kind of cause a little bit of a problem for us when it's going to cause a problem for us actually in the image. What do I mean by that? It means that if I've got somebody or something moving in the scene, when I take the photograph in normal flash mode, the flash fires at the beginning of the exposure, which means then if it travels through any ambient light, the subject, you're going to see these kind of light trails or whatever it is in front of them, okay? Usually we want the light trails to go behind them. And to do that, all we've got to do is basically use the other option on the flash setup in the sync mode, is not high speed sync, but work in second curtain sync. That does exactly what we're on about now. It fires the flash at the end of the exposure, so it gives us the light trail behind them instead of in front of them. And so as far as does shutter speed affect using flash, yes it does, okay? The first thing I would do I want to overpower the ambient light with flash? If so, I can either do that with increasing the exposure. So let's say I'm working out on location on a dullish day and I've basically got a working ambient aperture of 100 ISO, 125th of a second f4. Straight away, if I want to actually give more dominance to the flash, I underexpose the natural light. Now I can do that by just increasing the aperture if I'm wanting to use the flash for its effect, okay? So remember, flash and aperture have a relationship. Shutter speed really doesn't in its purity, okay? I've explained why it does though at some stage. So at this stage, if I increase my aperture to 5.6, I've underexposed the scene. Now what the flash is going to do, it's going to hit the subject to try and gain that perfect exposure. And if you're ever wondering in TTL mode why you always get a little green light here or a little noise, okay, it means that when you take the photograph and it gains the correct exposure, the green light comes on. That's a really good signal for you because that means it's gained exposure. So basically, if I've taken the photograph and I've overpowered the ambient by one stop, you'll definitely see the contrast and the light of the flash. It changes the whole look and the feel. Then if I'm looking to even darken down the ambient even more, I can either do another aperture, so I could go up from 5.6 to f8, and then all of a sudden the flash has got to work that little bit harder. However, by using the facility of the high-speed sync, I can still keep to my desired, say, working creative aperture of f4, and then I can just higher the shutter speeds to equal the underexposure of the ambient. That's really what we're doing. So as far as does it affect it? Yes, it does. As far as when we're dragging shutters inside a location and we're using that second curtain sync, obviously if you use too much of the ambient light within the scene, you're basically going to mix it all up. It's just going to look like mush. But the purity is shutter speed does have an effect when you start to look at the creativity of using a Speedlite flash or any flash in a kind of a working exposure. Hope you enjoyed this film. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.